Have you ever walked into a room full of people and felt something was wrong, even when everything looked normal? The laughter sounded convincing. The conversations flowed naturally. People smiled at the right moments. They nodded in agreement. They performed with confidence, certainty, and happiness. And yet, beneath the surface, something felt strangely empty, almost mechanical. You notice it in offices where co-workers laugh slightly too hard at jokes that are not funny. You notice it at dinner tables where people say, "I'm fine," with exhausted eyes. You notice it online, where entire identities are constructed like advertisements, carefully edited, emotionally filtered, optimized for approval, and eventually, if you observe long enough, an uncomfortable thought begins to form. What if most human interaction is performance, not because people are evil, but because people are afraid? Afraid of rejection, afraid of exclusion, afraid that if they revealed who they truly were, the world would quietly withdraw its affection. So they adapt. A different voice for different people, a different personality for different rooms, a different self for every environment. And after years of repetition, the performance becomes automatic. Most people are not expressing themselves. They are managing perception. That is why modern life often feels emotionally artificial. You are surrounded by people constantly calculating reactions, filtering thoughts, suppressing emotions, rehearsing responses before speaking them. Entire conversations happen without anyone saying what they truly mean. The strange part is that this behavior has become so normal, we rarely question it anymore. A man hates his job, but smiles through meetings for 20 years. A woman feels emotionally invisible, but keeps posting pictures that suggest fulfillment. A friend agrees with opinions they privately reject because disagreement risks isolation. Someone says they value honesty while carefully curating every detail others are allowed to see. And perhaps the darkest part of all this is that pretending is not always conscious. Sometimes people pretend to survive, sometimes they pretend to belong. Sometimes they pretend because they no longer remember who they are underneath the adaptation. You can see it in their exhaustion. There is a certain fatigue that emerges when a human being spends too long performing themselves instead of living themselves, because the mind was never designed to permanently divide itself. Yet modern society rewards exactly that. The world rewards performance more than honesty, not complete performance. Just enough to remain socially acceptable, just enough to avoid conflict, just enough to maintain approval. And slowly, without realizing it, people become actors trapped inside identities they never intentionally chose. You are not surrounded by personalities. You are surrounded by adaptations. Watch carefully the next time you enter a crowded place. Observe how quickly people scan the emotional atmosphere before speaking. Observe how often conversations become negotiations rather than expressions. Observe how rare genuine vulnerability actually is. Most people are studying reactions more than communicating truth. And the terrifying realization is this: people do not merely lie to others, they lie to themselves first, because self-deception is safer than self-confrontation. It is safer to believe the performance is real than to admit you have spent years becoming someone designed for survival rather than authenticity. That is why certain moments feel so unsettling. Occasionally, someone breaks character. The mask slips for a second. A forced smile collapses. A rehearsed personality flickers, and beneath it you glimpse something painfully human: fear, loneliness, confusion, emotional hunger. Then the performance returns, as though nothing happened. But once you begin noticing it, you see it everywhere: in politics, in friendships, in relationships, in corporate culture, in social media, even in yourself, especially in yourself. Because the uncomfortable truth is that nobody escapes this entirely. Every person alive has performed versions of themselves for acceptance. Every person has hidden thoughts to avoid rejection. Every person has betrayed some part of their authenticity to remain connected to others. The difference is that some people still know they are pretending. Others have forgotten, and once you see the performance, that you cannot unsee it. Human beings did not learn to pretend because they were weak. They learned because survival demanded it. Long before cities, governments, corporations, or social media existed, there was the tribe. A small group of humans surrounded by predators, disease, starvation, and uncertainty. In that world, isolation was not uncomfortable. It was fatal. To be rejected by the group often meant death. And so the human nervous system evolved around one terrifying possibility: abandonment. This is where the first mask was born. Not from vanity, not from manipulation, but from fear. Early humans quickly learned that acceptance required behavioral adaptation. Certain emotions strengthened tribal stability. Others threatened it. Anger toward the wrong person could create conflict. Vulnerability could lower status. Nonconformity could trigger suspicion. So people adjusted themselves accordingly. Even today, thousands of years later, your brain still carries remnants of that ancient survival code. You feel it when you hesitate before expressing an unpopular opinion. You feel it when silence in a conversation becomes uncomfortable. You feel it when rejection feels physically painful. Because to the primitive brain, social exclusion still resembles danger. Modern people like to believe they are independent thinkers. But psychologically, most humans remain deeply governed by approval, belonging, and social survival instincts. Carl Jung called this the persona, a psychological mask developed to help individuals function within society. Not entirely fake, not entirely real. A constructed version of the self designed for social acceptance. And the disturbing part is that this mask often develops so early, so gradually, that people mistake it for their identity. Pretending begins in childhood. A child cries too much and is told to be strong. A boy learns vulnerability makes others uncomfortable. A girl learns that being agreeable earns affection. A teenager studies social behavior like a survival manual, changing speech patterns, interests, humor, even personality traits depending on the group around them. Slowly, authenticity becomes edited, not because children consciously choose deception, but because they instinctively learn a dangerous truth. Love often appears conditional. Approval is rewarded. Disruption is punished. So the mind adapts. The child, who once expressed emotion, freely becomes emotionally calculated. The teenager who once spoke honestly begins monitoring every reaction in the room. The adult eventually becomes so practiced in adaptation that they no longer know where the performance ends. Most personalities are assembled rather than discovered. Think carefully about that. How much of who you are was chosen, and how much was rewarded? Your humor, your confidence, your political opinions, your ambitions, even your insecurities. How many emerged naturally, and how many were unconsciously shaped by the desire to belong, This is why society often feels psychologically theatrical. People are constantly mirroring each other, adjusting behavior based on invisible social feedback systems. The phenomenon is ancient. In royal courts, survival depended on mastering appearances. Aristocrats learned to hide emotion, flatter power, and perform loyalty. One wrong expression could destroy reputations or end lives. Niccolo Machiavelli understood this deeply. He observed that human beings often value appearances more than truth itself. In systems driven by power, perception becomes currency. That dynamic never disappeared. It simply evolved. Today, corporate environments reward emotional control, strategic likability, and carefully managed identities. Entire careers are built not only on competence, but on social calibration. People learn when to smile, when to remain silent, when to fake enthusiasm, when to appear confident despite internal collapse. Society does not train authenticity, it trains social efficiency, and the more complex civilization becomes, the more sophisticated the mask becomes with it. Social media intensified this process beyond anything in human history. Now people do not simply adapt in physical environments. They construct entire digital selves optimized for validation. A version attractive enough to be admired, successful enough to be envied, interesting enough to remain visible. And eventually, the performance becomes exhausting because people adapt so well to expectation that they forget they were adapting. Acceptance has always had a price. The mask that protects you can eventually replace you. That is the real danger of pretending. Not deception itself, but identification with the deception. At first, the mask is a tool for survival. Then it becomes habit. Then identity. And finally, prison. The greatest deception is not fooling others. It is forgetting that you are pretending. Once you understand that individuals wear masks, a more disturbing realization begins to emerge. The masks are coordinated. Pretending is not merely personal behavior. It is social architecture. Entire societies function through performance. The sociologist Irving Goffman described human interaction as a form of theater. According to his theory, people behave like actors on a stage, constantly managing impressions depending on the audience around them. A person at work performs one role. A person at home performs another. A person online performs yet another version entirely. And perhaps what is most unsettling is how natural this performance feels. People no longer simply live life, they curate it. Modern society has transformed identity into presentation. Every interaction becomes subtly strategic. Every opinion becomes socially calculated. Every emotion becomes filtered through the question, how will this affect how I am perceived? You can see it everywhere. Social media is the most obvious example. Entire platforms are built around controlled visibility. People carefully select which moments deserve public existence. Success is displayed. Suffering is hidden, unless it can be aesthetically packaged. Happiness becomes performance art. A couple argues in silence for weeks, then uploads smiling vacation photos. Someone feels emotionally empty but posts motivational quotes every morning. A person spends hours crafting the perfect image caption because even spontaneity must now appear intentional. The terrifying part is not the deception itself. It is how collectively accepted the deception has become. Everyone knows the performance is happening. Everyone participates. Anyway, modern identity is often public relations. Even morality has become performative. People publicly express outrage, not always because they deeply care, but because outrage signals virtue. Public opinion becomes less about truth and more about social positioning. Many people do not defend beliefs because they genuinely believe them. They defend beliefs because those beliefs protect identity, status, or belonging within a group, and the moment survival becomes connected to public image, honesty becomes dangerous. This is why so many conversations feel hollow. People are not communicating to understand each other. They are communicating to maintain social safety. Many people are not communicating. They are negotiating approval. Watch how quickly behavior changes depending on the audience. A person speaks. One way around co-workers, another way around friends, another way online, another way in. Private political identity becomes tribal. Relationships become status symbols. Productivity becomes self-worth. Even suffering becomes competitive. People do not simply want to experience life anymore. They want life witnessed, validated, and confirmed by others. Because modern systems have monetized attention itself. The human nervous system was never designed for permanent social exposure. Yet today, millions of people live inside invisible audiences. Every thought risks judgment. Every mistake risks humiliation. Every opinion risks cancellation or exclusion. So, people adapt by becoming safer, more polished, more predictable, but something essential disappears in that process: sincerity. Think about the last conversation, where someone spoke without filtering themselves, not strategically, not cautiously, not performatively, truly honestly. For many people, it is difficult to remember. That should disturb you, because when authenticity becomes rare, manipulation becomes easier. Social systems become more controllable when individuals fear social consequences more than internal. Dishonesty, fear-based conformity does not require force, only observation once. People know they are being watched by employers, peers, audiences, algorithms. They begin regulating themselves automatically. The result is collective self-deception on a massive scale. People applaud ideas. They privately doubt or defend systems. They secretly resent, maintain relationships that emotionally drain them, adopt opinions they never deeply examined, not because they are foolish, because belonging is psychologically addictive. Human beings will often sacrifice truth before they sacrifice connection. And technology amplified this ancient weakness beyond recognition. Algorithms reward emotional performance, attention rewards extremity, visibility rewards conformity within ideological tribes. The louder the performance, the deeper the insecurity. That is why modern society feels increasingly emotionally artificial. Everyone senses the performance, yet nobody wants to be the first to stop acting. And slowly, the entire culture begins to resemble a theater production, where every actor secretly suspects the script is false but continues reading lines anyway. You see it enforced. Optimism in corporate language, in political slogans, in influencer culture, in public relationships that collapse privately, in people smiling through emotional exhaustion because vulnerability threatens marketability. And beneath all of it exists a quiet collective fear. If people saw who I truly am, would I still belong? That question controls more human behavior than most realize, because the need for acceptance can shape personality more powerfully than truth itself. But pretending for too long comes with a cost, and eventually the mind begins to fracture under the weight of performance. There is a psychological price for pretending to be someone you are not. And eventually, the mind collects the debt. At first, the performance feels manageable. Small adjustments, small compromises. You hide certain emotions. You soften certain opinions. You become more agreeable, more efficient, more socially acceptable, nothing dramatic. But over time, those compromises accumulate, and one day, a strange feeling appears. You wake up exhausted, without understanding why. Not physical exhaustion, existential exhaustion, the kind that sleep cannot fix. Because maintaining a false self requires constant psychological energy. Every interaction becomes surveillance. Every environment requires recalibration. You monitor your tone, your expression, your reactions, your image. You become both the prisoner and the guard. Some people are exhausted because they have been acting for too long. The frightening part is that many high-functioning individuals experience this silently. They appear successful externally while internally feeling fragmented, emotionally disconnected, almost unreal. A respected professional secretly feels empty. A socially admired person feels invisible. Someone surrounded by friends feels profoundly alone because connection built upon performance never fully satisfies the human. And you can survive by becoming who people want. But eventually you stop recognizing yourself. Psychology has a term for this internal conflict: cognitive dissonance. It occurs when the external self and internal self drift too far apart. When behavior contradicts authentic emotion for extended periods, the nervous system begins experiencing chronic psychological tension. The result is anxiety, emotional numbness, identity confusion, depression without obvious cause, and modern life intensifies this fragmentation. Most people no longer maintain one identity. They maintain several: the work self, the family self, the online self, the romantic self, the socially acceptable self, and beneath all of them, the hidden self that rarely reaches daylight. Imagine carrying multiple versions of yourself every day for years. Eventually, the mind begins collapsing under the weight of contradiction. This is why so many people feel strangely detached from their own lives. They are functioning but not fully present, existing but not fully alive. Nietzsche warned about this in his criticism of social morality. He believed societies often encourage conformity so deeply that individuals lose contact with their instincts, desires, and genuine nature. People become obedient versions of themselves while internally decaying. Kierkegaard described despair in a similar way, not simply as sadness, but as the condition of being disconnected from one's true self. And perhaps that is the hidden epidemic of modern civilization. Not merely depression, not merely anxiety, but psychological alienation from the self. Carl Jung believed every human carries a shadow, the parts of themselves rejected, hidden, or suppressed in order to function socially. The more aggressively people construct socially acceptable identities, the larger the shadow often becomes. And shadows do not disappear. They wait. They emerge through burnout, emotional instability, resentment, addictions, quiet rage, or sudden psychological collapse, because human beings were never designed to permanently suppress themselves. The more artificial the world becomes, the more authenticity feels dangerous. Think about how many people secretly feel fraudulent, not because they are evil, not because they are manipulative, but because they no longer know which version of themselves is real. They have adapted so thoroughly that authenticity itself feels unfamiliar. You can hear it in certain late-night conversations when defenses weaken. Someone admits they do not know who they are anymore. Someone confesses feeling emotionally disconnected despite external success. Someone quietly reveals that their entire life feels performative, and often those are the most honest moments of their lives. Who are you when nobody is watching? That question terrifies people more than they admit, because many individuals have spent so long becoming desirable, acceptable, productive, attractive, agreeable, or successful that they never developed a relationship with themselves outside observation. You do not lose yourself all at once. You lose yourself in negotiations, one compromise at a time, one performance at a time, one silence at a time, until eventually even intimacy becomes difficult. This is why modern relationships often feel emotionally starved. People crave deep connection while simultaneously hiding their true thoughts, fears, insecurities, and desdo. This is why modern relationships often feel emotionally starved. People crave deep connection while simultaneously hiding their true thoughts, fears, insecurities, and desires. They want to be understood without revealing themselves. But intimacy without honesty becomes proximity without connection. Two performances interacting, nothing more. A person says, "I love you," while hiding resentment. Another says, "I'm okay," while emotionally collapsing. Someone fears vulnerability so deeply that they maintain emotional distance, even from those closest to them. And because vulnerability risks rejection, many choose loneliness disguised as control. Modern society rewards emotional performance while quietly punishing emotional honesty. Confidence is rewarded, certainty is rewarded, composure is rewarded. But confusion, sensitivity, existential fear, those are often hidden to maintain social value, so people become emotionally armored. And the tragedy is that the armor eventually prevents not only pain, but connection itself. That is why truly honest people often make others uncomfortable. There is a reason genuinely authentic people make others uncomfortable. Not performative authenticity, not carefully branded individuality, real authenticity, the kind that does not constantly seek permission, because authenticity has a strange psychological effect on groups. The moment one person stops performing, everyone around them becomes more aware of their own performance, and most people do not want that awareness. A person who speaks honestly in a culture of rehearsed communication becomes disruptive, not necessarily aggressive, not necessarily rebellious, simply disruptive by existing outside the expected script. This is why social systems often punish authenticity in subtle ways. Not always through direct violence, but through mockery, isolation, labeling, silent exclusion. Human groups instinctively protect emotional equilibrium. When someone behaves too differently, speaks too honestly, or refuses certain social rituals, they unintentionally expose the artificiality others depend on psychologically. People fear honesty because honesty rearranges hierarchy. History is filled with examples of this pattern. Socrates questioned the intellectual certainty of Athens and was sentenced to death, not because he was physically dangerous, but because he disrupted social confidence. He forced people to confront contradictions they preferred avoiding. Diogenes abandoned social status entirely, mocked power openly, and lived with radical simplicity. To many, he appeared insane, but beneath the absurdity was something deeply threatening. A man almost completely detached from social approval. That kind of freedom unsettles societies. George Orwell understood this dynamic as well. He recognized that systems of control do not survive merely through force. They survive by shaping acceptable thought, acceptable language, acceptable identity. The individual who sees through collective illusions becomes psychologically dangerous because perception itself is power. And this pattern extends far beyond philosophy. Whistleblowers are often attacked more aggressively than corruption itself. Truth-tellers become targets. Dissidents become isolated. People who expose dysfunction frequently experience more hostility than the dysfunction they exposed. Why? Because systems rely on predictability. Predictable workers, predictable citizens, predictable consumers, predictable identities. The more emotionally dependent people become on external validation, the easier they are to influence. Approval becomes leverage. Fear becomes governance. This is why modern institutions rarely need total authoritarian control. Most people regulate themselves automatically. They censor thoughts before speaking them. They soften opinions before expressing them. They monitor themselves constantly because belonging feels psychologically necessary. But authentic individuals become difficult to control, not because they are fearless, but because they begin valuing internal coherence more than external approval. That changes everything. If your identity depends entirely on approval, are your choices really yours? That question alone can destabilize an entire worldview. Because many decisions people believe are personal are deeply shaped by invisible social incentives. Careers chosen for status, opinions adopted for acceptance, relationships maintained for image, beliefs inherited through fear of exclusion. Power structures understand this better than most individuals do. Machiavelli observed that rulers maintain stability not merely through strength, but through managing perception and controlling incentives. Reward obedience, punish disruption, encourage conformity while disguising it as morality or responsibility, and societies still operate this way. People are praised for fitting smoothly into systems, even when those systems quietly damage them psychologically. The obedient are considered mature. The adaptable are considered successful. The emotionally compliant are considered stable. Meanwhile, individuals who question foundational assumptions are often described as difficult, cynical, unstable, arrogant, or dangerous. Authenticity is disruptive in a world built on performance, because authenticity weakens manipulation. A person who no longer requires constant validation becomes less controllable by shame, status, or social pressure. Fear loses some of its authority over them. Control becomes difficult when fear disappears. That does not mean authentic people become superior. It means they become psychologically independent in ways many systems do not encourage. And independence always carries risk. Authenticity is psychologically dangerous because it risks rejection. You may lose approval. You may lose relationships built entirely on performance. You may discover that certain connections only survived because you remained strategically incomplete. But authenticity is also psychologically liberating because it restores alignment between the inner self and outer self. No more constant division, no more endless calibration, no more living as fragmented versions of yourself. Just clarity. And clarity changes how power operates around you, because the person who sees the game differently can no longer participate unconsciously. But seeing the illusion is only the beginning. The harder question is what happens after. Seeing the performance is unsettling, but learning how to live beyond it is even harder. Because once you recognize how much of society operates through masks, a dangerous temptation appears: cynicism, the urge to withdraw completely, to distrust everyone, to assume all human behavior is manipulation, but that is not wisdom. It is exhaustion disguised as intelligence. The goal is not to become emotionally cold. The goal is not to reject society entirely. And authenticity is not reckless self-expression or brutal honesty without restraint. Authenticity is alignment. It is the slow process of reducing the distance between who you are internally and who you become externally. Nothing more, nothing less. And for many people, that process begins with an uncomfortable realization. They do not actually know who they are, not completely. Because years of adaptation create psychological echoes. People mirror environments so consistently that eventually they lose the ability to distinguish personal desire from social conditioning. They know what gains approval. They know what creates attraction. They know what sounds intelligent. They know what identity is rewarded. But remove the audience, and confusion begins. What would remain if nobody expected anything from you? That question can feel strangely empty at first, because many identities are built reactively rather than consciously. People become versions of themselves, designed around fear, validation, expectation, or survival. Entire personalities emerge from adaptation patterns established years earlier. The person who constantly pleases others may secretly fear abandonment. The person obsessed with success may fear invisibility. The person performing confidence may fear worthlessness. Once you begin observing yourself honestly, these patterns become difficult to ignore, and that observation changes something important. You stop automatically believing every social impulse. You notice how often behavior is motivated by approval. You notice how quickly fear alters personality. You notice how deeply external validation shapes emotional stability. That awareness is the beginning of psychological freedom, not dramatic freedom, quiet freedom. The ability to pause before performing. The ability to tolerate misunderstanding. The ability to survive disapproval without collapsing internally. Freedom begins where performance ends, but authenticity requires sacrifice. Some people will dislike the version of you that stops adapting to their expectations. Certain relationships survive only through mutual performance. Some social environments depend entirely on emotional conformity. And when you stop participating unconsciously, tension emerges. That tension is not always failure. Sometimes it is evidence of transformation. The Stoics understood this deeply. Thinkers like Marcus Aurelius emphasized internal stability over external approval. They believed emotional freedom begins when a person stops outsourcing identity to public opinion. Not because society is irrelevant, but because dependence creates vulnerability. A calm mind is difficult to manipulate. Existentialist philosophers reached similar conclusions. Jean-Paul Sartre argued that many people live in bad faith, constructing artificial identities to escape the anxiety of true freedom. Authenticity requires confronting uncertainty directly instead of hiding inside roles assigned by society. That confrontation is uncomfortable because once you stop blaming systems entirely, you must face yourself, your habits, your compromises, your fears, your performances. Carl Jung believed psychological growth depends on integration, the process of acknowledging hidden aspects of the self instead of suppressing them. Real maturity is not becoming socially perfect. It is becoming psychologically whole, and wholeness is quieter than performance. You no longer need every room to approve of you. You no longer shapeshift constantly to maintain belonging. You stop performing. Certainty you do not feel. You stop constructing identities entirely around reaction. Instead, you become more internally anchored. The strongest identity is the one that does not need constant validation. That does not mean isolation. Human beings will always need connection, but there is a profound difference between connection and dependence. Dependence says, "Tell me who I am." Authenticity says, "I know who I am, and I choose to connect anyway." That distinction changes relationships, work, ambition, even thought itself. Because once fear stops governing every interaction, honesty becomes less terrifying. You begin speaking more clearly, thinking more independently, existing with less internal fragmentation. And strangely, life becomes calmer, not easier, calmer. Because pretending requires endless psychological maintenance. Authenticity reduces that burden. You waste less energy managing perception and more energy actually living. You begin noticing how much noise in society is generated by insecurity, how much conflict emerges from performance, how many systems survive through fear of exclusion. And slowly, your relationship with the world changes, not rebellious, not arrogant, just awake. Most people spend their lives becoming acceptable. Very few spend it becoming real. Now, when you look at the world again, something feels different. The crowded rooms, the polished conversations, the carefully managed identities, the artificial smiles that appear and disappear with mechanical precision. You still see the performance, but now you understand why it exists. Most people are not pretending because they are malicious. They are pretending because they are afraid. Afraid of rejection, afraid of irrelevance, afraid that without the performance, they would no longer be loved, respected, desired, or accepted. And once you recognize that, society begins looking less like a collection of individuals and more like a network of survival strategies. Some people hide behind success, others behind intelligence, others behind humor. Morality, productivity, beauty, or emotional detachment. Different masks, same fear. But occasionally, you encounter someone different, someone calm, someone difficult to manipulate, someone who speaks carefully because they no longer need to constantly perform. Certainty, someone who can exist without desperately managing perception. And there is something strangely unsettling about such people, because the most dangerous person in modern society is not the loudest person, not the most aggressive, not the most powerful, not even the most intelligent. It is the person who understands the game and no longer depends entirely on it. The person who sees manipulation clearly, who recognizes how fear shapes behavior, who understands how approval controls identity, and who slowly stops allowing that fear to dictate every decision. That kind of person becomes difficult to control psychologically, not because they reject society entirely, but because they stop worshipping it. They can walk through systems without becoming completely consumed by them. They can participate without losing themselves entirely inside performance. And that changes the balance of power. Because the moment you stop needing permission to be yourself, power changes hands, not external power, internal power, the kind built from psychological clarity rather than social applause. And this transformation is quieter than most people expect. It does not always look dramatic. Sometimes it simply looks like honesty, boundaries, silence, independent thought, the refusal to betray yourself for acceptance. You are not losing people. You are losing performances. That realization hurts at first, because some relationships survive only through mutual masks. Some environments require suppression to function. Some people prefer the version of you that was easier to predict, but eventually something else emerges beneath the discomfort, relief, the relief of no longer dividing yourself endlessly, the relief of speaking without constant calculation, the relief of existing without performing every second of your life. Some masks protect you, others bury you, and perhaps the strangest part of all this is that authenticity does not make life perfect. It does not remove loneliness, conflict, or uncertainty. In some ways, it increases them, because once you see through the performance, returning to unconscious imitation becomes almost impossible. You begin noticing hidden fear inside, confidence, hidden insecurity inside, arrogance, hidden loneliness inside, attention seeking, hidden exhaustion inside perfectionism. You begin recognizing how deeply human beings hunger for connection while simultaneously fearing exposure. And maybe that is the real tragedy of modern life. Not that people are dishonest, but that so many people no longer believe they are safe enough to be real. So they adapt, perform, smile, curate, suppress, and the performance continues. But now you know something most people spend their entire lives avoiding. A human being can survive through performance and still slowly disappear inside it. And perhaps that is why authenticity feels so rare today. Because in a world built on performance, being real is an act of quiet rebellion.